Hello, and a warm welcome to all of you back for the second day of the World Heritage City Lab, Historic Cities, Climate Change, Water and Energy. I'm Jyoti Hosagrahar. I'm the Deputy Director of the World Heritage Cities Program I'm the Deputy Director of the World Heritage Center and also leading the World Heritage Cities Program. It's my great pleasure to welcome you back for day 2 of this conference. We had some very interesting and important outcomes from yesterday. I'll try to capture, it was a very complex set of papers and presentations and points that were made, interventions, panel discussions, that brought out a range of different issues globally. I will try to capture a little bit of what was said. And then today, we want to focus a bit more on some local experiences. So we're going to dive deep into a few case studies from different regions of the world to see really what strategies these cities are using, what impacts they are facing with regard to climate change, and what strategies they are adopting, and what could perhaps offer lessons, even if they were strategies that they have traditionally adopted. And we also have several excellent speakers lined up, as well as very exciting panel discussions. So I want to just take a minute to review some of the things that we heard yesterday, in case you were not with us, just to capture. So the key points raised first was that soft values should be integrated as part of development plans to improve the quality through the living environment, keeping in mind a pivotal element, which is heritage. There was a lot of emphasis on laws and regulations for climate action and how to integrate these, how to integrate heritage into these laws and actions, because now that many cities are making a concerted effort to, especially with regard to mitigation, how does heritage get integrated into these laws and action plans? A second point had to do more with youth and the way that the strategic approach to integrating youth into the efforts, the initiatives. This is not only important in terms of engaging community, but also because we want to be able to see youth as the stewards of heritage protection looking into the future. So there was also some interesting discussion around the integration of traditional building materials and technology, as well as the debate between contemporary understandings and needs versus the future understandings and needs. And this, I think, is a very important point as well to reflect on. When discussing water, historic cities, or historic water cities, the issue of the scale of intervention is also something that requires further analysis. The idea of looking at heritage and urban development with water rather than simply controlling it was also something that speakers drew attention to, that in a sense, current efforts at planning and design often are aimed at controlling and keeping out water rather than designing with it. Mechanisms for developing solutions that in this way engage and work with water, work with natural rhythms rather than against them or keeping them out, I think were important. There's a links also to the issue of metropolitan versus small towns, rising sea levels, is an everyday reality in the Caribbean. And the issue of integrating local heritage-based solutions for climate resilience and sustainable development was also emphasized. And it was very interesting to hear that in the Caribbean, they're no longer talking about English, French, or Dutch heritage, but rather of Caribbean heritage, which is today's reality. The possibility that smaller towns offer for testing and giving an impulse to these kind of smart city ideas where disaster risk management and disaster risk reduction can be looked at in terms of natural rhythms, integrating heritage management and conservation into disaster reduction plans and strategies, with a focus also on landscape approach. A landscape approach was emphasized. The historical dimension is very key in looking at water-related heritage. The idea of learning from the past, the mechanisms and strategies integrating social and economic were emphasized, and adaptive reuse and regeneration of historic places was also emphasized. A lot was said about local communities and their role and knowledge, looking also at the economic level and the changes, and integrating green infrastructure into management plans, revitalizing and reinforcing linkages with local and historical urban green spaces, water systems, and local agriculture was also emphasized. Promoting green and low carbon transport and infrastructure services was considered, and looking also at increasing transportation, renewable energy sources, and looking at waste management along with it. So today we're going to look more now at the concrete means of implementation and discuss tools, strategies, issues, and future possibilities concerning historic cities in the context of climate change, looking also at water management and energy transition, and how these could contribute together to climate action and resilience. So to begin with, I'm very pleased to invite now Mr. Shigeru Sato, Professor Emeritus, Director of the Waseda Institute of Urban and Regional Studies at Waseda University in Japan, who joins us by a video lecture talking about Thua Thien Hue in Vietnam. Let's listen now to Professor Sato. He's in the session, but just for clarity, he has offered to do the video presentation. So of course, for any questions, he's very much present in the session.
Hello everyone, I'm Shigeru Sato, Waseda University. I'm very honored to have this opportunity here today. My topic is Historic Eco-Museum of Hue, a lesson from Jerome Thun. Through this presentation, I'd like to show you how the Hue is a beautiful historic eco-museum, and to highlight the various challenges and directions for solution. My first visit to Hue is summer of 1998, attending international conference on conservation and rehabilitation of historic heritage there. Since then, I'm involved in research and conservation project with my colleagues through collaborative work with Hue Monument Conservation Center. Through continuous researches, I'm impressed with the integrated ecosystem and cultural landscape, just appearance of historic eco-museum. The citadel of Fue is a historical city built by Zhorong, the first emperor of the Yuan dynasty, starting in 1802. It was registered as a World Heritage Site in 1993, along with a group of historical sites located in the Huang River Basin. The urban framework of Fue has a relationship with the surrounding landscape, especially the mountains, in what we call Yama-ate, making vista toward the mountains. In Fue, we can find symbolic waterways, street, and viewpoint designed with such view corridors. As a result, the surrounding landscape and the townscape are integrated to create a cultural landscape, and the beauty of change of scenery can be enjoyed in harmony with the surroundings. A similar example can be found in the design method of a historical city in Japan. Thus, it is said that Fue was designed using the Feng Shui geography theory, a traditional method of environmental design originating in China, to face the Huang River, harmonize with the surrounding natural conditions, and place a screen-shaped mountain in front. The citadel of Fue strictly follows the design method of Chinese capitals. However, the mechanism for controlling the water environment was designed based on ecological idea unique to Fue, Vietnam, reflecting the climate and topography. With the support of UNESCO Hanoi office and in cooperation with HMCC, we published a report on the guideline for the drainage system in the citadel in 2007, clarifying and respecting these traditional techniques and systems. After this survey, the research was extended to the entire Huang River Basin, especially to the mausoleums of the early four emperors, where these methods were considered to be particularly well adapted. All of them have lakes within the mausoleums and have built ecological systems that are integrated with the surrounding territories. It is said that they were modeled after the imperial mausoleum of the Ming Dynasty in China, but it is clear that they express the unique method and idea of the Yuan dynasty. These ideas were realized in more unique and sophisticated ways in the tomb and the territory of the first emperor, Zhorong. I'd like to talk about these methods based on our research findings. This is the panoramic view of the Emperor Zhorong Mausoleum. Under the Zhorong direction, his Feng Shui officials found a suitable location. Construction began in 1814 and was completed in 1847. The design concept can be read from this original drawing, which looks like fisheye map, named Tinto Territory Picture Map. The catchment area is depicted with modified surrounding mountains. However, there are some differences between this drawing and the current situation. If this drawing is the original ideal plan, it may have been changed during construction or modified slightly after construction. Through the analysis of historical materials and the investigation of current situation, I will describe the cultural landscape from the 3 points of view shown here. Firstly, landscape based on the ecological principles. Second, water management system suitable to tropical monsoon climate. Thirdly, traditional management system collaborated with local community. Emperor Zheorong chose the place that best fulfills the principle of Feng Shui to build his mausoleum and royal tomb complex, where it's surrounded by characteristic shaped mountains having each meaning, waterfalls, and filled with energy. You can see the carefully designed relationship between the imperial tomb and the surroundings like mountains, rivers, etc. However, the lake in this hotel was created by landscaping the original rice paddies, and the surrounding mountains were also landscaped by gently cutting the tops, according to historical document. This drawing shows not only the realm of Feng Shui theory, but also his ideal model of the world, the image of a country that the Yuan dynasty aimed to create, a rural village and dynasty integrated by an ecological order surrounded by a rich natural environment. In order to realize these ideas, various components are arranged as shown in this map. The lakes and the waterways were created based on ecological design principle as a water management system for irrigating rice paddies and as a foreground for the beautiful mountain scenery. In this way, a landscape centered on the tomb and the water management system are integrated to create a world of harmony, the paradise after death. The surrounding mountains depicted in this drawing are an accurate representation of reality according to a specific iconography from some viewpoint. For example, the topography of Mount Tianfo can be seen to be accurately depicted in this way. Next, on water management system. The monsoon climate in this region brings a lot of rainfall at one time, so water control system and the devices are needed to cope with it. The entire Tianfo territory has been carefully designed with ponds, canals, and other water harvesting and flood control systems that shape the landscape, as well as irrigating systems that enrich the paddy field and the farmland. Here are 3 of the devices used to control the water flow at Long Lake, right in front of the Jianlong tomb. You can see original images of masonry waterway, sturdy sluice gate, and emergency reservoir as flood control pond, each function of rainy and dry season. As I will explain later, these devices are not fully functional today. During the rainy seasons, a large amount of water that falls on the mountains flows into the area around the tomb, and these devices function at that time. The lake in the imperial tomb functions as a catchment basin, and overflowing water accumulates in the surrounding rice field and then flows out into Huang River. The entire area around the Joron tomb has been irrigated by this system, creating a rich agricultural production and a landscape of water and mountains. The third is role of local community. Maintenance is essential for water control devices against nature. At Joron tomb, the community had been responsible for maintenance and the water system of this area. The area around the Joron tomb had been inhabited before the imperial tomb was constructed, but with the construction of the mausoleum, the demon village was formed along with the people who are brought in as guardians. As you can see in this picture, there exist paddy fields and the surrounding villages. By considering this, we can guess that the villagers were in charge of management of water environment in the past times. The people of demon villages cultivated the rice paddies and used the forest. The water facility of the royal tomb were important for their livelihood. Conserving the tomb complex and its water facilities meant making their livelihood. In other words, they are closely related and support each other. This close relationship with the surrounding area and the mausoleum in the Joron tomb complex is common to the four early emperors' tombs, although each has its own distinctive composition. This kind of carefully designed relationship between the natural topography and the built environment is also found throughout the Fon River Basin when we draw fisheye map of entire region. Next, I'd like to talk about current situation and the problems of historic ecological system. But now, these historical facilities have been broken and they cannot fulfill the original function to maintain the water system. Scientific research should be conducted to determine the actual status of these appropriate technologies. Then, the conservation and upgrading of these facilities should be considered together with local community who are responsible for them. Excavation by HMCC in 2019 revealed the presence of a strong revetment that was carefully considered to prevent sediment from entering Long Lake, as shown in the figure. The restoration of these facilities is currently being carried out by HMCC. We believe that these effects and the impact need to be carefully analyzed. The other problem is the planting of acacia trees for cash income. Traditional pine groves have been replaced rapidly by fast-growing trees to be used as a wood pulp material. Many places in this region have been cut down within 4 or 5 years of planting acacia. There is a danger that this will lead to environmental destruction such as sediment runoff. The local government has also begun to make efforts to restore the original vegetation such as pine trees. The problems described above are caused by the fact that each of the individual elements that make up the cultural landscape has its own problems, and at the same time, the relationship between them has been severed. While restoring these relationships, it is necessary to promote the conservation and restoration of each of them. As a step toward solving the issues mentioned above and moving the historic eco-museum forward, we have developed an eco-study tour program. And after repeated social experiments, we are now at the stage of implementation. Through this eco-study tour, participants will have the opportunity to discover the value of a holistic, traditionally constructed ecological system and its relationship to the cultural landscape. This kind of workshop enables the local community and the government officials to recognize traditional values and local pride. The fisheye map shown before is very good for getting a total picture of the territory, and the tour map was made on it. Participants will tour the entire area drawn by Empire Jaron with this map. It can also be used as a fun. We set up a travel agency as a social business. In March of this year, we also carried out a social experiment of a hybrid eco-tour under the COVID-19 disaster, in which people from overseas could participate. I enjoyed this hybrid tour from Tokyo. I'd like to conclude by pointing out the three issues presented here. It is necessary to conserve and regenerate the total ecological system that exists in the city and the region of where not just the conservation and the restoration of historical architecture. We can conserve and revitalize the historical urban and regional environment so that the unique climate, culture, and the tradition of the region form a cultural landscape in harmony with sustainable realm. To do this, we must further elucidate the appropriate technology for environmental and landscape control that have been developed and adapted over the years, and conserve and revitalize them while creating appropriate technologies for the present day based on a common understanding. One river basin has sophisticated ecological management system, so we call this region Historic Eco-Museum, good opportunity to run sustainable development. The lesson from Jaron term is that traditional systems are sustainable in themselves. However, they are fragile and easily forgotten, changing with climate and changing lives. How to revitalize them in collaboration with the government and the local community is an important challenge for our time. This is our research team members list. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Sato. That was really a very, very rich presentation. And you pointed out some very important things about historic ecological systems and their revitalization. I believe there are a couple more slides that somehow did not make it into the video. I request my colleague Alba to please kindly share these additional slides so we can complete this presentation.
Yes, hello everyone. Professor Sato has shared with us a couple of extra slides as food for thought. And as you have seen through his presentation, the merit of the region is in its environmental design and the technology to control water. And as we saw, we find landscapes within landscapes. So we are talking about holistic cultural landscapes that are connected through the Perfume or Huang River, creating a bigger landscape altogether and connected by the flow of water. In this case, the value or the attributes go beyond the built fabric of a town, a village, or the tombs, but connect with the Asian philosophy principles such as Feng Shui, wind and water, Sansui, which is mountains and water, and the Japanese concept of Fudo, which refers to the how climate and the environment we live in determines our cultures. As well, this region is frequently hit by disasters, especially floods, and these systems allowed to be more resilient to them, and also involve the community in these resiliency methods. So we can see that this philosophy is completely different from modern approaches and methods, for example, civil engineering and construction technology that are applied worldwide. So, next please. The challenge here would be to think of what possibilities for management we have in this context. As you see in the first image in red, these are the registered monuments protected by the national law, but this is a very limited part of this system. So how and with what tools we could protect these regional systems? You see in a second image, the elements that compose the landscape of the tombs or the system of the tombs. These include as well the actual views, the water catchment areas, and the water structures that make part of this original design. But if we want a step forward, we would be talking not only about protection, but also about protecting the activity. So that would be the third image. We would be talking of a regional management system that would include protection tools and also, let's say, guidelines for urban constructions, land use, and finally, soft tools that could be eco-tours like the one Sato-sensei presented, could be the protection of the agricultural systems next to tombs, could be encouragement of sustainable forestry, etc. So this is for you to reflect on later during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We now move to, and thank you to Professor Sato. We now move to the next presentation, which is on the historic cities in Yemen by Mr. Ivan Tung, Program Manager and Technical Advisor at UN Habitat in the Amman office. Mr. Tung, over to you.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity to present. My name is Ivan, and I'm indeed working with UN Habitat. And I will present here today some results of a study we did for 7 cities in Yemen, which covered the impacts of conflict on the cities and also on the heritage. With the heritage component, we actually collaborated with UNESCO. With the UNESCO Gulf and Yemen office to get more depth on the challenges to heritage in these areas that relate both to the conflict, but also to longer term stresses such as water and climate change. Okay, so in this presentation, I will, what we didn't cover were what you would think of as the more traditional historic cities, such as the very famous areas of Shibam or Zubayd, which are heritage listed. But we focus in particular on those cities that do have heritage sites and that do have historical urban landscapes, but that are not listed as such. Next slide, please. Okay, heritage in Yemen is actually very interesting because it is very closely related to water management. One of the most famous sites is, for example, the old dam in Mareb, which was even mentioned in the Quran. We have the cisterns of Tawila in Aden, one of the biggest water management structures. And there's a whole set of historic water management practices that relate mostly to the management and regulation of water in the hillsides. So the management of water is very, very closely integrated into the culture. Although with urbanization and with the destruction of some of the sites and knowledge, this is now increasingly under threat. So what I want to focus in this presentation on is mainly the 4 critical threats to historic sites, cities in Yemen. So these are not just the threats that you would see, for example, in terms of damage to mosques, but really threats to the historical urban landscapes. So the first one is the conflict impacts and damages in a broad range of the heritage cities. The second one is water. So these are current and future expected flooding events. We will go into that. The third is urbanization, not necessarily urbanization strictly in itself, but really the large displacement that had taken place during the conflict. And then finally, a lack of skills and the capacity to manage, maintain heritage, as well as prevent looting as part of the sort of general chaos that occurred after and during the crisis. So I will go through in a sort of bird's eye views through 3 cities to discuss these themes and how they play out there. Next slide. So to look at the conflict impact that are not directly related to mosques and listed sites, we first can have a look at the overall damages that have taken place in Yemen. And we look at it through remote sensing analysis and through site reports from government technical advisors. And with our assessments, we can see that it was huge damage, more than 100,000 houses damages in different cities, with 17,000 in Sana'a, about 15,000 in Aden, and then also about 12,000 in the historic city of Saada. Next slide, please. The 4th city that I didn't mention was the city of Taiz, which has a lot of mosques, but also has a very particular urban pattern that developed as part of the urbanization of the agricultural lands. You can see here an image that we took from with drone imagery. Next slide, please. This city has been on the front lines of conflict for the last 6 years, where a part of the city was governed by the Houthis, and another part of the city is under control of the legitimate government. And on this map, you can see a damage assessment of the structures in Taiz city, and you can see a high concentration of damages in the hillsides a little bit to the south. Next, please. As a result of that, a large part of the urban fabric has been destroyed, and connected to that, we saw a huge amount of looting of the historical sites. So this, what you can see here on the right, is a survey of the government officials in what they see as the main challenges to heritage, and really some of the main ones were looting of ancient documents, looting of artifacts, as well as the destruction actually sometimes of sites where, for example, some ammunition was stored. Next slide, please. As part of that sort of general destruction, what we also saw was a complete collapse of the electricity infrastructure. This has a lot of problems for for example, the industries, but also just for access of electricity generally in the city. One advantage of this historical urban fabric, though, was that the large amount of roofs of individual buildings made it very easy for people to generate their own electricity through solar panels. Next slide. Okay, so what we saw in Thais was a challenge generally of sort of the destruction of the urban fabric. And we see something similar in Aden, Aden city, which is now currently the capital of Yemen. And what we see there is actually a coming together of the four challenges that are identified in the first slide. So the first challenge is just generally the damages. The second challenge, informal urbanization. The third challenge, water, and then finally the poor management. So just starting with destruction, again, here a map of the destruction of the city, part of our study. Next slide. Then we identified all the historical sites that were damaged and their functionality. And what we could see there is that a large part of the structures were indeed damaged, but not all of them. Actually, a majority of them were not damaged just directly from bombing, but mostly because of a general neglect. And you can see that in the next slide. You can see here, for example, on the left side, part of the damaged structure, the Turkish bath in Khormaksar. But then you can also see a general neglect of, an old heritage building such as the State Borough House. So its neglect is almost just as important in conflict areas as just the direct impact from bombing. Then there's a third factor that plays into the case of Aden and in the case of other cities, which is the impacts of climate change. What you can see here is the projections of expected increases of temperature in various cities in Yemen, where in Aden the expected increase with moderate to extreme scenarios is between 1 and 2 degrees of warming. Next slide. This has different impacts in different cities. So in Aden, it will be particularly bad in terms of temperature, but other cities will actually see more flooding. Next slide. Using some remote sensing analysis, we can see here the potential flooding areas in Aden, and these are the kind of maps that are they're not very known actually in the city. So whereas there's a lot of focus on how to reconstruct our houses, integrating water management in that aspect is most of the time not done yet. Especially water management in terms of future flooding from sea level rise. Next slide. At the same time, so we have this one stressor of water, which is not being addressed, and the other one is informal urbanization. So as a result of displacement, I believe there were about 4 million people displaced in Yemen. There's a huge explosion of informal settlements in every city. We can see here some of the main locations. And the important point to heritage here is that much of that informal urbanization also encroaches on some heritage sites. So, for example, in the southern peninsula, we could see a lot of structures built along the Turkish path and around some of the citadel areas. And if that sort of continues, it becomes very difficult to deal with that in a good way. Next slide. Yeah, these two elements are also in play in another city a little bit to the northeast in El Halta. You can see here it's a bit of a smaller city that lies very close to a wadi. And here the population pressures were such that many of the historical buildings have been occupied by IDPs, as well as being occupied by government and military activities. So that is a problem for the heritage department. When we talk to them, they see actually the occupation of buildings by displaced persons as one of the threats to heritage. and they see another threat to heritage being here, potential flooding. So El Halta is really, sorry, go back. Yeah, El Halta is a city made out of mud bricks, and they have a lot of periodic flooding from the Wadi from the north, and they see this increasing in the future. And so one question from them to us is, how can we actually improve water management in this area so that we can prevent damage to the mud brick houses? It's a question that's not resolved yet, but it's something that I put out here. Okay, then I will just end with the city of Mareb. Sorry, next slide. Here, again, two things come together. On the one hand, a sort of long-standing neglect, and on the other hand, urbanization that is going from the north to the south. So in the north of the city, before the conflict, there were about 50,000 people living there. That exploded to almost 500,000 people, so 10 times more people. This urbanization moved largely to the north, but is also coming closer and closer to some of the old heritage sites. And if you go to the next slide, we can see here, this is really the old town of Mareb, to the south of the city. You can see the state in the upper right corner and the state in the corner left. So there's an enormous disappearance of the old structures, which is partly due to just weather factors, partly to destruction of bombing. And what we can observe now here is again, the encroachment of informal structures around this area, so that it will become more and more difficult in the future to do something about it. This is the end. Yeah, I didn't give a lot of solutions, I have to say, in this presentation, but it's because we're here in an evolving, rapidly evolving situation. And I think one of the possibilities for Yemen to attack this problem is to really focus on their long-standing culture of water management. So many of the challenges relate somehow to water management and housing, and reviving this culture through trainings and through plans, I think, is one of the factors or one of the approaches that they should take to preserve not just the historical sites, but more importantly, the historical urban landscapes in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Zeng. That was a very rich presentation with a number of cities and a lot for us to think about in these the different systems that you're talking about. Thank you very much, and we will now move to our third presentation before we have some discussion with questions and answers. Please do keep your questions ready so that you can enter them into the question or chat box. Don't hesitate to do that as you go along. We will pick them up after the next presentation. So we will move now to the presentation of on the Kasbah of Algiers. We had initially planned to have Mr. Mohammed Ali Ouenje talking about the city of Lamu, but we understand that there are some technical difficulties in his connecting at this moment. So we will first move ahead to have the presentation of Mr. Abdullah Zekag, who is the head of the protection plan for the World Heritage Site, the Kasbah of Algiers in Algeria, is a teacher and researcher at the National Polytechnic School of Algiers in Algeria. Mr. Zekag, over to you. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this invitation. And I'd also like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to set out the important situation on this global heritage site, which is related to a situation dating back to the 19th and 20th centuries, and which has done some damage and is still doing damage to the traditional fabric of the Algiers Kasbah. The Algiers Kasbah is well known, of course. It's in the city of Algiers, the capital, which has a population of a little less than 4 million and quite strong density of 2,650 inhabitants per square kilometre. Its map coordinates well known. It's known by various terms in Berber, the joyful, the well-protected, the white city, and it's the most populous city in Algeria. It's also the beating heart of the capital of Algiers. Now, it was classified in 1992 under criteria 2 and 5 of exceptional universal value, recognized in 2009. It's deemed to be a significant example of a Maghreb historic city, which had major influence on urbanism in the western part of the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, on the Mediterranean coast, the site was inhabited as early as the 6th century AD, and this has been borne out by evidence that we found some very interesting structures between 9 and 10 meters in depth during excavations accompanied by the World Heritage Committee. And we've discovered more than 10 million pieces 10,000 pieces during these excavations. Now, the Kasbah from the Phoenician times designated the climax of the Medina of the Zirid era, and it applies to the whole of the old city of El Jazid in the limits marked by the ramparts of the Ottoman era. And then there was major urbanization during that era as of the 16th century, when the authority of the Ottoman power was in the lower part of the Kasbah, and then subsequently, as of the 19th century, it reached the higher part, the citadel of Algiers, known as El Sultan. And this is a living environment with some 50,000 inhabitants. And we need to mention them because we have a law on cultural heritage dating back to 1998, and it imposes a presidential decree, imposes limits of 50,000 people. So this area still conserves very interesting traditional dwellings, Tuiwet, as we call them, there are 3 types of them. And of course, all of the accompanying equipment, such as palaces, hammams, mosques, and souks, and so on. And this all bears witness to a stratification of several trends in a complex and original system, which has adapted with remarkable flexibility. But it's also very vulnerable. It's on various levels. There's some 130 meters between the lowest point and the highest point, so it descends towards the sea, and activities in the seaward direction were very important. The attributes of exceptional universal value are still in place. The Kasbah bears witness to remarkable authenticity in terms of form and design, very dense urban fabric, building materials such as terracotta bricks, and also limestone and other stones and wood, and above all timber. The main one is the tuiwa, which is disappearing because there are just a few forests still in existence, but they're protected and cannot be harvested. And then, of course, there are traditional commercial bodies, buildings, and also places of worship. And we've seen the survival of traditional architectural know-how, the various crafts for building and architectural decoration, which is a major asset in supporting its exceptional universal value. As for the description, well, it's one of the finest maritime sites in the Mediterranean, overlooking islets and a Carthage counter, which was established in the 4th century. And it is a unique type of Medina where you have a blend of an Islamic city and a place of remembrance as well as of history. It includes the vestiges of the citadel, ancient mosques. There were around 50 now. There are much fewer, and a whole series of fountains, which were established along the descent, which provided fresh water to the inhabitants. And then Ottoman palaces, which are being restored. There's a major operation which began in 2014, and the state has thrown a huge amount of money at rebuilding these buildings and the public bodies. And then there's also traditional urban structure with a huge sense of community. Next slide. Now, to give you an idea of this site, if you look immediately at the map on the right, it delimits the World Heritage Site. The blue delimited parts are the limits of the World Heritage Site, and the red delimited areas are the limits of what we call a safeguarded Casbah sector, which is much bigger than the World Heritage Site per se, which is a good thing because there is additional surface area being protected in addition to the World Heritage Site. And so the safeguarded site represents some 150 hectares today, whereas the World Heritage Site amounts to about 60 hectares. So this was made a safeguarded sector in 2005 through an executive decree. And between 2007 and 2010, a permanent safeguarding plan for protection of the Casbah was developed in 3 phases. This plan was headed. I was the head of the project of this project, and I attended all of the various emergency operations which were carried out inside this site, and which covered about a third of the dwellings in terms of emergency operations. And in 2012, this was approved. 2011, it was approved by the Popular Assembly of the Vilayat, which were the elected officials from the whole region of Algiers, representing 55 elected officials. So it was then all approved by that Popular Assembly, and then promulgated an executive decree. And what we need to stress here is that this Casbah site is situated not only in one single municipal area, it straddles four municipal councils and 4 mayors and political authorities. So the Casbah recommends more than 70% of the site. And then on the right, you have Bab el Oued, which is another municipal council, and on the left-hand side, the Algiers Centre, and then where you have the Citadel, Oued Khoury. So we had to negotiate with 4 different leaders, 4 different mayors, from different municipal councils in order to be able to implement this plan.
Suite.
Next slide, please. So, while that safeguarding plan was being drafted from 2008 onwards, we were able to undertake emergency work, and that was possible with with certain planning permissions, and you know that each part of the property is balanced in a careful balance with the others, and so we had to be very, very careful to make sure that we had everything stabilized, so as not to lose some of this heritage from and all of the changes that have been made over the 18th and 19th centuries. And so one of the things that we had to do was to make sure that the wastewater drainage channels and that the water pipes for fresh water were in good condition. So many sections had to be replated, and as well as the manholes and the drain holes that needed to be cleared out. Over the last century, many of the households actually used water from major reservoirs, and they collect all of the terrace runoff water, and then later when that's used not for drinking but for household tasks. If you want drinking water, you would have to go out to any of the 53 different public fountains in the Casbah to get drinking water. In 2013, then, this date, we first of all had expounded on this plan, showed it to the government, and in 2013 the government decided to set up a first envelope for that first tranche of work covering it was about 24 billion dinars would be the whole cost for the project, and so this first tranche was just about 25% of that. So we're talking about a significant amount of money so as to be able to restore those. And between 2008 and 2014, once the initial emergency work had been had been performed on the build firm, then we were able to undertake the next level. And up to 2016, this was a very important part of the work because the built heritage, some of them had actually fallen into ruin. And we know why. We know that there was infiltration by water. We know that there was a lack of maintenance during some of the darker periods through which the city had passed, and also there was so what this meant was that a lot of segments of the freshwater piping needed to be fixed or replaced. We needed to remove any of the sediment and build up in some of the drain holes. Some of this was made worse over massive downpours of rain. And up to today, these works are still ongoing. In particular, you can see this on the larger palace, which is at the low part of the Casbah. And then we've got some of the more minor palaces that also need ongoing work. I'd say they're about 80% finished now. Some parts have actually already been completed and are now open to the public, and so members of the public are able to visit these marvelous buildings. We also undertook work on the cluster of dwellings at the very heart of the Casbah. These are what we call the places of memory, and they're connected with the Battle of Algiers and all of that history. And so during the colonial era, we've identified more than some 11 places of memory, and these houses and dwellings, which are all clustered together, all stuck together one to the other, are now undergoing a restoration as well. Moreover, there was a whole lot of safeguarding digs undertaken in the lower part that would be on the right-hand side of the mat, where the metro line actually passes. Initially, with the metro plan, we weren't actually too keen to have the metro go through, but then we thought, well, we've absolutely got to get involved with these major urban development projects because it's going to actually really help traffic flow without people having to resort to their cars. And so with 250,000 passengers per day, this is a major project for the Casbah. And it means that we were able to undertake excavations and we were able to supervise some initial digs before actually identifying the final plan for the metro. And in the yellow part on the right of the map, some 800 square meters were dug along with the National Archaeological Center of Algeria and the National Institute, the INRAP, from France, that took over more than 2 years to undertake these digs, which means that 2,000 years of history were laid bare. And with the UNESCO's agreement and the agreement of the World Heritage Center, we were able to ensure that the metro station could be put where there was no archaeological remains. And we had under the town council building some very deep foundations, and so that was a safe place to use. So we managed to find a suitable place for the metro station, and then we also wanted to incorporate an underground museum into the site. So by taking the metro, you actually get to visit part of Algiers' underground heritage, and this was a very important way of promoting heritage and the importance of heritage at the same time. So visitors could, on the one hand, conveniently move from place to place, and secondly, learn more about the heritage and history of the city. The digs were undertaken then, and it was also by the same firms who did that, who actually also financed part of the digs. So, and here we have the historical development, and this is the heart of our discussion here today. We could see here on the map on the right what the city used to be like. This is what the Casbah used to look like in the Ottoman Empire. And so this is before any modern interventions in the 19th and 20th centuries. So it actually followed through the topography very, very well. And in blue, you can see the natural runoff areas, which actually just follows the natural topography of the area. So these little flows of water, the channels of water, would naturally go through that. And now these same runoff streaks have actually become the streets. They became the streets of the Casbah. So underneath the streets, you actually have the natural drainage right down to the sea. And then it was after this period that you had the first intervention on the lower part of the city in the colonial era. And this was when finally incursions were made into the natural fabric. And so here what you have is the topography of the site, and what you can see in red is the part that was most altered, and the slope is very steep there. In the yellow part it's less steep, and green is almost level. And so what you can see is that the lines for the natural runoff, the topographical runoff, have gradually been altered. So this is what the water network used to look like prior to the 19th and 20th centuries. It was essentially the natural ravine with the natural water flows, and the Casbah going right up to the peak of that triangular area. And so the deep ravines, and then the natural runoff of water, these water courses that would follow their natural course down the slopes all the way down to the coastline. And on the right, here you have the first incursions, which were made in the French period, in which they wanted a major plaza, the Place d'Armes, which was there. And this meant that streets needed to be widened. And so there were two other sections during this first phase that were very, very important, which actually did unnaturally alter the site. It had a certain logic if you follow the topography, and that is that on if you follow the main Boulevard de l'Histoire down here, and you'll be able to see some photos of that shortly, right down the middle of the Casbah, there, this was completely cut off in that section part, and then you've got the big broad avenues with the Place des Martyrs at the bottom. So this is a map that I think does actually show how the water runoff, natural runoff, was reduced, and then there were 4 aqueducts that brought water from very far away, between 19 and 32 kilometers worth of transit for water to the Casbah of Alger, and those were the major aqueducts bringing water. One arrived on the eastern side of Hama, and then the Stabsteed, and then further north the Citadel, and then these this water that was transported by the aqueducts was stored in 2 major reservoirs, and then in the city itself there were 50 plus city fountains where people could get their drinking water. On the western side, you had another minor reservoir. So all of these water sections also got broken up by the modern interventions of urbanization, and that caused some problems because the buildings that were put in at the time, the 19th and 20th centuries, have underground basements, and what we've realized is that those basements in those buildings were often prone to flooding, and nobody understood where the water came from. Everybody thought that it was perhaps just because the buildings themselves didn't have enough maintenance done, but later we realized that this was natural runoff underground of their water coming from the original water sources, or they were these buildings had actually cut into what would be a natural runoff area, and so that led to problems for those buildings, be they modern buildings or not. But even some of the older buildings, the older constructions, had this problem of flooded basements. So this obviously led to humidity problems. Experts understand exactly how bad that is for people's health, but also it led to soil destabilization and some landslides, which meant that some houses did collapse. I'm not saying this is the only reason why the buildings collapsed, but it certainly did contribute to that problem. If we look at the next slide, here you have the Boulevard de la Victoire, and this is just below the Citadel. You can see the tall colonial era buildings from the French period, and some of these buildings reach as high as 4 stories. And then there's another phenomenon linked to this. On the one hand, we have the visual aspect, which obviously, if you've got the Citadel of Alger, which was supposed to be visible from everywhere in the city, but actually with these 4-story buildings, some of the views are have been destroyed. But on top of that, the Boulevard de la Victoire now has this kind of terraced areas. If you look at the left side, you can see a 5 or 6 meter drop in height because the rock had to be cut away in order to make a level street, and this means that the normal runoff of water has been altered. Remember, we said that there was a problem with the flooded basements in the colonial houses, but also there were problems with stability for that. And if you look at the map on the right hand side, you can see in red everything that was built during the colonial modern period. And in blue, these are the incursions into the original areas where you've got the where the buildings were traditionally built in the old way. So you can see that you can imagine what this means for the substrata. it means that it's only Bastion 2-3 that has actually been maintained. But many areas were completely destroyed in order to make way for these grand buildings. And we've even got 16-story buildings, which means that this Casbah, which has been part of our iconography from the 17th through to the 19th century, has been completely disfigured. In some places you can no longer see the citadel. And it's true that some of the houses that are red on the left-hand side are of very beautiful architecture. And they are very beautiful, well-proportioned houses which don't actually disfigure the Casbah in an ugly way, but it does mean that it was greatly altered. And if we move to the next slide, you can see some photos. And what's really surprising here is that since there was the natural tissue on the Boulevard de Victoire had been cut, and some of the rock removed in order to make that level thoroughfare, we've had to put in steps in order to reach the original level of the slope. And so that is why you have these steps, and so there are huge stability problems all along the slopes because of this now. Here what we have is an excerpt from a book by Zeynep Çelik, and he wrote in English that the French architects had actually, when they were undertaking these incursions in the Casbah region, they had to deal with very difficult terrain, which had using the technology of the time, but they also had this problem in connecting the different networks together. Now, what were the key issues? What needed doing? Well, as I said a moment ago, what we needed to do was go back to the modern era piping and underground systems, and we realized that some of those underground water systems were the cause of some of the collapses, which means that we had to, first of all, reconstruct and replace some of the pipes. But we needed to do more than that if we would try to get as close as possible to the original Ottoman era runoff topography. And so that meant going back to the traditional fabric, so what we had to do was do upstream capture of the water. We had to identify and go back as closely as possible to those original waterways, in order to ensure the continuity of this natural water flow. And in that way, by respecting those original flows, we would avoid the problems. Another important aspect for these modern era buildings was to ensure that modern windows were in there. Excuse me for interrupting. Yes?
Je vous entends.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oui, peut-être.
Yes, it might be time for us to wrap up and move on to our next. Thank you. Yes, I'm nearly there.
Allô?
Merci beaucoup.
Je vous en prie.
Thank you. No problem.
Est-ce que vous êtes terminé?
Have you finished? Well, there was one other slide, and I wanted to show you an operation we've carried out on major parts of the colonial area which were penetrated. You can see the network is, and then superimpose the state of the buildings in red. You can see where the buildings are really imperiled, And we've repaired the three main catchment areas and assured the stability of those buildings. We couldn't restore the buildings without previously covered those networks, and that was a job carried out by a specialized company in Algeria without digging. We avoided any digging because the lower part represents the commercial part of the city. So there's the major flows of people, and we worked in basements without actually disturbing the population. Next slide. Now, this isn't particularly clear, but it's the state of conservation of buildings, and you can see that along the natural flow lines we have buildings which are in jeopardy, or some which are ruined or very dilapidated, and which need to be restored at all costs. Now, there's a major problem with these operations, especially on individual dwellings. Some 80% of these properties are privately owned, so there's a problem of financial operations with lots of private players, very often heirs from families, and we say that the owners have to contribute financially to these operations, and the state may provide between 25 and 75% of the money for such restoration. The major mosques and hammams are being restored. Some houses as well have been restored, and we hope that the citizens will understand this, so they also contribute. And there you have some pictures, some images, concrete examples of the intersection between the flow line and the information on a collapse of a group of houses. And then that's it, I think. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this extremely detailed and rich presentation, especially really helping us to focus on the issues of the natural processes in a very densely built up historic city. I think this is an extremely important approach to understanding the ecosystem and the region within which the Casbah sits and how it operates. So thank you very much for this. We have now listened to three very interesting case studies, and we have the opportunity now to open up for questions. I see that there's several people who have been sitting very patiently listening to these. So now is the time to raise questions and also to make your own comments, perhaps from your experiences, to share on your thoughts on these presentations. Do we have any hands raised or any questions? Please enter your questions into the chat box or the question box. Yes, I see that one of our participants, Mr. Lassana Cissé, has a question. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la.
Thank you, moderator. I just wanted to ask a question. The sound is very, very poor, and there's no camera. Can the speaker please put his camera on? We've been told about the Casbah being very complex. Sound is really not clear enough.
Excusez-moi, Monsieur Cissé, on n'entend pas.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cissé, we can't hear you clearly.
Le son est très mauvais.
The sound is very poor.
Allô?
Est-ce que vous pouvez placer le micro?
Could you move the microphone closer?
Allô? Allô?
Monsieur Cissé?
Allô, vous m'entendez? Vous m'entendez maintenant?
Oui, oui.
Can you hear me?
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, un peu mieux, mais...
Can you move the microphone closer?
Amount of support and interest in design for values as a generic
Oui, allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
So
Voilà,
those
je
two things
disais que
pointed me to the proposal that I've now just wrote down for like general. Let's basically
Et
continue
au
it
sein
as
de
it
quel programme il
is.
y a voilà, je crois que c'est ça qui pose problème. Alors,
Voilà, là, ça va mieux, là.
vous entendez? Voilà,
So I'm thinking of the Algerian program of the European Union on heritage. And in that program, there's an aspect, a section on the Casbah. Can you tell us what the contributions have been from that program? I think it ended in 2019 or last year. It was a major program. And can you tell us about some of the results? You talked about the water plans, the rehabilitation plans for the Casbah. Could you tell us a bit about that? Well, yes, thank you indeed. There was a European Union program funding action in Algiers, not just in the Casbah, incidentally, but also a major monument in the east of Algeria, which is a famous tomb. And for the Casbah in Algiers, they started with the safeguarding plan, which we had established, and they collected all the information, and they tried to do something within the Casbah from one bastion to another bastion, Bastion 8 from the Ottoman Empire to Bastion 11, following through the various major mosques in the upper part of the Casbah. They also proposed interventions throughout, all the way along that line for houses, places of worship and public buildings. They also offered to intervene on a patch of houses. To give an example of what tomorrow could involve the entire rehabilitation of the Casbah. And the European Union's programme didn't actually affect the whole of the Casbah. It just pinpointed certain points in the safeguarding plan and homed in on certain key areas of the plan, because we know the upper part of the Casbah is a little bit deserted because some of the houses have collapsed, others are abandoned, so they wanted to reinvigorate the upper part, particularly the Amr Ali neighborhood, where there was still the traditional fabric intact and which had not been affected by modern-day urbanization. So we've seen the results, and we'll use them for the next stages. We were expecting more from the European Union programme. We're expecting there to be a contribution to the restoration of a number of other buildings. Unfortunately, the programme came to an end before that could be done, but maybe there'll be another tranche to restart it. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Are there other questions? I see there is one in the chat. So I will read this out. This is a question from Ms. Amira Renai. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Abdullah Zekag, for your presentation. My question is on the authorization for how to deal with archaeological sites which have emerged from these operations, and what is being done to make the most of that heritage. Well, if I can answer, in 2008, the metro project was set forward, and it did not at all take into account the World Heritage Site, So the Culture Ministry reacted and forced the work to be done in conjunction with the Culture Ministry. The metro operation is a major project, but it must respect this World Heritage Site. So we set up a joint group involving the Algiers Metro people and the structures in the Culture Ministry. And we also called on the World Heritage Committee, the World Heritage Centre, who sent us to experts tracking this project for the metro. We even had specialised engineers advising how we should intervene with these underground structures. And on the Martyr Square, where the metro was supposed to pass, we had to make sure that all the excavations had ended, because there were excavations underway there. And we've also identified vestiges from the Punic era, even from thousands of years ago, and even the Roman era, under the Martyr Square, between 3 and 9 meters in depth. Because the site is a sloping site, even in the Roman era, the Roman settlement followed that existing gradient, that existing slope. Then we had the Byzantine era, and then the Islamic era, and so on. So it's a sort of millefeuille, a sort of layered pastry spanning many historical eras. So we use the IMRAP experts and also the archaeological research experts who decided which parts should be documented and removed so that we could go deeper. Once you take one layer off, you then need to decide whether you can go any deeper to another stratum and so on until you get to the bottom. Well, there's the result. The various strata have to be put into an underground museum, which citizens can visit. There are some 700 meters squared visible from Martyr Square. You can see them, and you can go and see them. They're protected, and they should be part of this underground infrastructure hosting a museum connected to the metro. So it's a way of conserving the whole history of the Algiers Casbah and the heart of the Casbah on Martyr Square, Place des Martyrs. Now, of course, this has a major impact on the local population and the external population, because everybody coming in by metro will go past these ruins or vestiges, which will relate the history of Algiers with modern technology, providing guide services showing that whole history of Algiers. Now, the museum has not been produced yet. The metro is finished, but we are going to use geotextile fabric to protect this. So we'll be putting in sand so that people will be able to discover this new structure. Thank you. And can I just add one minor detail? If you're on level 3 of the metro at the bottom, there are doors which lead straight into the Roman Forum. And if you go a level up, you'll then have doors heading into the Islamic medieval era. And when you get to the top, near the exit, you have access to the Ottoman stratum. And inside, there are connections between the various strata. I'm talking about the archaeological strata, while there's also a connection with each part of the metro. So it's a very good way of reconciling urban development with protection of heritage. We shouldn't oppose such projects. You just need to support it and track it to ensure that the modernity nonetheless protects the ancient site. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take the 2 quick questions, and I will ask Mr. Thung to respond and to do so very briefly. The first is a question For Mr. Thung, a lot of your work has been remote, based on remote sensing. How have you coped with not being on the site? Have you been collaborating with other partners on the site? Have local partners or residents been involved in any of the mapping exercises? And do you think this was or could be useful? A second question, also for Mr. Thung, is many thanks to all the presenters for their interesting presentation. This is from Mr. Medeni Teklemariam from Ethiopia. I'm sorry, from the city of Asmara. Many thanks to all the presenters for their interesting presentation. I would like to know to what extent the traditional water management practices are applicable nowadays in Tuatien Hue and Yemen. Professor Sato had to leave, so we will ask Mr. Thung if you would like to respond to both these questions.
Hi. I can respond. Let me start with responding to the first question. Yes, a lot of work was done remotely. That was really unfortunate because it was just too difficult to enter the cities in many circumstances, not being able to get visas, fighting, etc. So we did a few methodologies. So one of them was just remote sensing, very simple satellite image assessments. We developed a few surveys for all the cities, so to understand what were some of the challenges in management of the sites. And then we did manage to hold a few workshops with locals on site, actually. So one with people from Al-Halta and one with people from Aden, in order to basically verify some of the analysis. Indeed, also the local heritage departments and also a few other departments, such as the water department, were involved with some mapping exercises. So mapping some of the main heritage buildings, mapping some of the buildings under threat, and then also mapping some of the flooding areas. So it would definitely not have been possible to conduct all the work just with remote sensing, and we really needed that component as well. And then we were in some conversation with the UNESCO office that managed to implement some projects in Sana'a and some cash for work projects. So we managed to get some more information through them as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So we will, I think, is that all? Were you going to say anything else?
No, that's it. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to move now to the next three presentations. Our next presentation is on the Paraty and Ilha Grande culture and biodiversity in Brazil. And this is by Gabriel Ramos Costa, who is the director of the Patrimonio Mundial, Secretaria Executiva de Governo Brasil.
Yes.
Welcome, Mr. Gabriel Ramos Costa. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hi, good morning to you all. First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to talk about Paraty and Ilha Grande. So basically, Paraty and Ilha Grande, it's biodiversity, it's World Heritage in Culture and Biodiversity. And in the next slide, I'm gonna show you a video about the city and hope you're having a good experience about Paraty and having a good idea.
Boa noite. natureza que veio para nos cachorros. Remédio para tudo. Cachoeira.
Para mim, não falou que paga.
Paraty é único porque tem muita cultura, é uma cidade que vive de festa, o povo nosso é um povo alegre.
Isso aqui, para nós, vale ouro.
Next, please. So Paraty is a charming landscape that houses a unique historical center, preserving marks from the colonial past in its house and stone floors. It has a bay formed by hundreds of beaches and dozens of islands, in addition to the exuberance of the Atlantic forest, preserved with all its natural wealth. World Heritage City, Paraty is the scene of different festivals and folklore traditions, locus of union between the past and the present. Final point of the Gold Trail, land of colors, smell, and flavors, artists, legends, and histories. Next, please. So the mixed site of Paraty culture and biodiversity stands alone by being inserted in a natural and cultural context, and it's a result of a number of and functional systems in land and island sectors. The amphitheater of the mountains of Serra do Mar and the Atlantic forest involve the plain where the historical center of Paraty and its extensions are located, including the village of Paraty-Mirim, the Caiçaras village, old farms, the remains of the defense systems, and the paths between the hills and the sea. This territory reaches the base of Paraty and Ilha Grande, with its capes, mangroves, islands, and inlets. inserted in natural environmental protection area, the ways of doing and living of the traditional communities perpetuating time and space. The proposed World Heritage Site is comprised by a center area, including protected areas and historical assets, and by the protection zones of the dominated property, buffered zone, jointly totaling approximately 404 hectares. This area is spread throughout the cities of Paraty and Angra dos Reis in the state of Rio de Janeiro, and the cities of Cunha, Ubatuba, Areias, and São José do Barreiro, and in the state of São Paulo. So Paraty, just for you to have an idea, is right on the bottom of Rio de Janeiro state at the end, and we are on the border with São Paulo state as well. So next, please. So in this slide, you can see in the green part, the Paraty. The big circle is the central part of Paraty, but all of that is Paraty. And right in front, there is this big island, which would be Ilha Grande. Ilha Grande is not in Paraty, it stays in Angra dos Reis, which is a city near just our neighbor city. And then this entire green area here, circled with orange line, is the entire mixed World Heritage map. But the city of Paraty is a little bit smaller than that. Next slide, please. Next, please. So this is, as I said before, Paraty has many beaches and islands with a quiet bay. This is one of our beaches in Paraty, a local and traditional Caiçara village. This is just like very few families living, linked economic basically by tourism and the fishing activity. This is Praia Grande Beach, which is staying in Paraty at Pouso da Cajaíba. You can see on a photograph the Atlantic forest on the mountain on the back of the beach. And you can see the river crossing, cutting the beach in two parts. And this is a good example of the way to coexist in the vegetation and the population, the way that we live here. Next slide, please. Next. So this is a photograph of the central part. You can see this is the photograph taken by the port of the city, which is staying in the central part of Paraty. As you can see, all the boats, those boats is not for fishing activity, is more for tourism activity. We have two separate places, one for fishing activities and one for the tourism. From there, you can see you have a view to the historical center with the all Portuguese line on our construction and on our historical center. The church that you see there is the oldest church of the central part. It's not the oldest church of the city. And on the back, you see the mountains where I said before it makes like this natural amphitheater. The mountains on the back of the city, and right in front of us, not so close, we have Ilha Grande, providing this natural amphitheater that I said before. So this is the mountain of Floresta Atlântica, Atlantic Forest, and Serra do Mar. Next, please. So Paraty is located south of Rio de Janeiro, as I said before, right on a border with São Paulo state. Until the 17th century, its inhabitants were concentrated only by the indigenous until you have the Portuguese coming and the colonization period of Brazil. So basically, Paraty experienced 3-4 economic cycles in our history. The first one was the gold. Basically, the Portuguese found all the gold at Minas Gerais state, but Minas Gerais, there is no seaboard. So they built up the gold trail, or the royal trail as some of them, to extract all the gold taken in Minas Gerais into Paraty, and from Paraty send it to Portugal. During that time, in the 17th century, it became the second most important, 18th century, sorry, the second most important port of Brazil, missing only for the capital, which was the Rio de Janeiro. And then after that, we went through the sugarcane cycle and the coffee production. After that, we didn't have, Paraty stayed isolated in time and geographically, can connect to the capital of Rio de Janeiro only by the sea. So this isolation preserved not only the historical part of Paraty, but all the nature that we have here. And all the hills that were once was used to cultivate sugarcane and coffee, we start to restart to grow all the natural environment that we have here. So only at 1970s, the new road was built connecting Paraty to Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, which are the biggest cities of Brazil. And then we start to develop again and to be more known, not only nationally, but internationally. The municipality of Paraty has currently more than 45,000 inhabitants. And in nowadays, our economy is based only on tourism, first, and secondly, with the fishing activities. This is a photograph of the historical center. As you can see again, another church, and the historical part of Paraty. The mountains well preserved again on the back of the photograph. And this is the river, Perequiaçu River, which crossed the central part of Paraty, ending in the sea, of course. This photograph was taken at Pontal Beach, which is the beach in the central part of Paraty, where the river cross. We have this combination, rivers and sea all together always. Next, please. So Paraty owns 78% of our territory occupied by environmentally protected areas. The population of Paraty is really diverse, consisting of caiçaras. So caiçaras is traditional coast fishing communities of mixed Europeans, Africans, and indigenous ancestry. We have quilombolas as well, which is a Maroon communities, descendants of Africans and slaves, indigenous, and descendants of immigrants from various parts of the world and of Brazil, of course, a reliable portrait of Paraty, Brazilian diversity. The site of Paraty culture and biodiversity consists in four protected areas, main areas, which is the Serra da Bocanha National Park. We have Cairuçu Environment Protection Area, Ilha Grande State Park, and Praia do Sul Biological Reserve in Ilha Grande, and also by the historical neighborhood and Morro da Vila Velha. So the city is home to 3 indigenous lands, 2 quilombolas communities, and 28 caiçaras communities, which live on the relationship with nature, artisanal fishing, and sustainable management of their biodiversity. Traditional communities still maintain the ways of life of their ancestors, preserving their culture, festivities, and religion. Next, please. So this is a photograph that you can show as I said before, Paraty is very unique because we have the sea. We are the central part of Paraty is on sea level, and this photograph was taken on the top of our mountains here at Serra do Mar. Right at the end of the photograph, you can see at the middle, you can see Ilha Grande. So that's why we say that makes this natural amphitheater, exactly. So Paraty, the central part, is a little bit on the right side. At the end of the photograph, it's hidden by the mountains, you can see. But you can see all the mountains covered with a deep forest and well preserved. and most of our populations and communities lives on the flat part of Paraty, and Ilha Grande is a little bit further on the left side of the photograph. Next, please. So in 2017, we started to collect data about Paraty, and we realized it became a World Heritage City. And we realized that we have a well and naturally made gastronomy and creativity chain in the city. So we stopped a little bit to prepare our data, collect our data, and prepare our papers to become an international World Heritage Site. And we applied to become a creative city in the network as creative city by UNESCO. So in 2017, we were recognized and became part of this selected group, which is very proud to be part of. This year, we had to prepare and apply and send our report saying what we have done and what the things that we are planning to do in the next 4 years. And it's been really exciting and really good for us. And it was something that happened really naturally. We just have to collect the data and put on a paper and send it. And something that happens naturally in the city. And this feel is this photograph is one of our beach. Next, please. So only in 2019, we become a World Heritage Site by UNESCO as a mixed site in culture and biodiversity. And in this case, I must say that we are the first city in Brazil to become a mixed heritage site. I think we might be the only one in Latin America, and we are the only one definitely in Brazil to have both recognition by UNESCO as a creative city in gastronomy and mixed heritage site by UNESCO. Next, please. So again, this is another photograph, clear, where you can see our calm water, calm bay, filled up with Iceland, and then the deep forest that we have here. Paraty is a really good place for people who are fond of bird watching because of our diversity, because of the heights in the city. In such a small amount of time and kilometers, you leave from the sea level and you reach the top of the mountains, and then that is very unique and very exquisite, as I might say. Next, please. Another photograph again. This photograph was taken at the sunset. One of our caiçaras fishing in our calm water and bay. And yeah, it's one sample of like artisanal fishing. And thank you very much. I am Gabriel Costa. Those are my contact. If you need any further questions, if you need more information, please get in touch with me. It was a pleasure. Hope you enjoy it as much as I. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really an amazing presentation, and thank you for bringing these points about biodiversity and urban areas to us. I think that's a very, very important point to look at that relationship. We will be listening to more about biodiversity and the natural environment with the historic city. Moving now to listen to Mr. Nilkan Chaya, who's the UNESCO Chair Professor on Culture, Habitat and Sustainable Development at the Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore in India. Professor Chaya will be talking about the Keres, the underground water structures in Bidar in India. Professor Chaya.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk at this extremely interesting set of discussions. I'm going to talk about the Keres in Bidar. Bidar is in the peninsular part of India, within the Deccan Plateau, The map shows you where it is in the Indian peninsula. It's a very unique city because it's a confluence of very many different cultures, different languages, different ways of living, all coming together. So the city, as it was historically, consisted of a citadel and a fort and a town, which was also walled. And within this town, there were many artisanal crafts, many kinds of ways of livelihoods. It was a very interesting city, which was set up by the Barid Shahi rulers in the Bahmani kingdom. So this is in the 15th century. There is a kind of contact between India and Persia. And of course, across the Indian Ocean, there were many such contacts. And the Bahmani kingdom extended right from somewhere near Goa up to Hyderabad. And Bidar is part of what is known as the Dakhani culture. So it was a very important city in that time. But today, of course, it has become one of the smaller cities of the state of Karnataka. Next slide, please. Many of the important monuments which were built during the
famous last words. I just wanted to leave as well because I also have another meeting, but I think it's an interesting discussion. And now I like the words that Catalijn said. There's 80-20 and 20-80, and I think the 80-20
Excuse me, I think somebody's microphone is on.
Because they are already in, and the 20-80, maybe they...
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So several of the monuments in Bidar within the fort area were listed as because they are very important Indo-Islamic architecture. There is the confluence of influences from Persia, from West Asia, from South India, and from East Africa. And it's wonderful how all of these have come together to make the various structures. At the top left, you see within the fort a water pool. In the next slide, you see now the main thing that I'm going to talk about. So it is the Karez of, it's known as the Naubad Karez. So it's very interesting how water was such an important part of city building in that period. You have to keep in mind that we are in a fairly arid part of India here at Bidar. And it was important, if you built a city, to make sure that you could bring water to the residents of the city. And the Persian method of making qanats is here called karez. And the expertise of well building that India had developed and the expertise of making karez or qanats, which came from the Persian system, they come together here to make a series of qanats. It is thought that Bidar had several such underground tunnels which brought water to the city. Now, the Naubat Karez has been excavated and reopened very carefully, and the water now flows again. And it's a wonderful lesson in how the management of water, the governance of how water comes to the city, the engineering and construction techniques are all interrelated with a cultural paradigm which says water is the most valuable thing that human beings have. So this channel runs on a distance across 3.5 kilometers. And at every 50 meters, there is a shaft which, yes, thank you, there is a shaft which ventilates the carrés, which also allows for rainwater harvesting, but it's mainly to ensure the flow of water because the air pressure has to be maintained the same. So this is an aerial view of Bidar showing the path of the tunnel which brings the water into the city. And at the bottom right, you see a photograph. At the top left, you see a section of this carrés. So at some distance from the city, the water is collected in open land and collected in a sort of large tank or lake, and from there it is allowed to go into an underground tunnel almost 80 meters below the ground, and which takes the water all the way to the center of the city. It's a wonderful way of bringing water, and these were several of them all around. Next. So Srishti Institute has been working with a great number of local collaborators. So this work was taken up by an organization called Yuva, and they worked on the opening up of the canal. So almost 1.5 kilometers has been cleaned, has been opened up, so the water is flowing again. And there was a master well digger from Kerala, that is a traditional artisanal expertise that comes into this. And then there were volunteers and engineers. So you can see here that there is a combination of a modern technology and traditional knowledge. Without the well digger from Kerala, we could not have done this work. And so you'll be interested to know that there was even a snake catcher and staff from the health department as the work went on, because you were likely to find snakes within this. And you can see the work of clearing up this carrés going on in the various photographs that you can see on the left. And it was not a single person or a single institution. You can see in this list that there are historians, journalists, government officers, there are the Deccan Heritage Foundation, the Indian Heritage Cities Network, there are people from Iran, and there are a whole lot of partners to this project, including the Ministry of Tourism and the municipal administration and Yuva. So Srishti is part of a large number of organizations, and I think this is one of the lessons, that we work together with local authorities, local people, local NGOs to bring about some improvement in the knowledge about these things. So you can see that the water which comes out, now after the cleaning up has happened, we are able to measure how much water comes out, and it is upwards of 1.5 million liters a day from simply one Carrez. And if there were more, that means that the city was well provided for in terms of water. And what is lost in history, if it is brought back, then you are going to have a massive infusion of a need, as water is very, very valuable. All of these would start bringing back to Bidar some of the facilities that it had. But it requires a multi-dimensional approach. But this, it looks like it's a small tunnel, but it's a huge amount of water that is being harvested in the fields around Bidar and brought into the city. Next slide. So this is a map which shows another Carrez and connected to the old city. So it passes through the old city, through the heritage city, and all the major structures in the old city are served by this, apart from the public access to water that it gives also. Next slide. So you can see here, this is the fabric of the old city. On the right-hand bottom, you can see a map of the city, and the dots show the position of the Carrez, and the basements of some buildings are cooled, in fact, by the water passing through the Carrez. And there are wells, and there are places where there are ponds in which the water is available to the public, and the vents are also ways in which you can draw the water out. So it's a wonderful combination. So how do you make this? How do you make the people at large participants in this? So the Srishti students have been working on creating various ways in which everybody in the city becomes part of this activity, so that there is support for doing this work. There is an understanding that water is so important to life. There has been thought on that, and we can renovate that, we can bring it back, and the importance of taking care of all of these historical moments is brought to the people. So you can see here that there is a newspaper page which was designed, and there are stories done, there are cartoons drawn, there are comic strips which are done by the students at Srishti to make people aware. This newspaper page is known as Bidar Ki Awaaz, which means the voice of Bidar. And so the design school is able to contribute to this kind of a process of bringing about public awareness. Other ways in which this can happen is, for example, a digital narrative map of the Naubad Carrez. So you have all the places along the Carrez where you can stop and you can listen to a story. This is something being designed by one of the students at Bidar, and it will be available as an app by which public youth, for example, especially children and members of the public, can start getting to know that Bidar has this wonderful heritage, which, if taken care of, can reduce dependence on water by large infrastructural projects, and can bring about a very good improvement in health situation and so on. But for that, we first have to become aware of the fact that this was a major provision in Bidar. And so for that is the next thing. There are other things that students have done. For the school and youth activities, stories have been written. There's one called The Fallen Sitafal. Sitafal is a custard apple. And so when it falls, then it grows, a tree grows there, and so on. And so there is a story which weaves the water and the vegetation into one continuous narrative. And the schools take part in activities of walking along the route where you can see both the monuments and the various important structures which were built during the Barid Shahi times. Very wonderful, beautiful, and instructive historical monuments. And along that route are the stories of all these places which the students present. And students also go there and participate in conducting these walks. So this is a very interesting thing that with the support of Yuva, or in close collaboration with Yuva, Shrishti is trying to bring about public awareness about the Karez. Next. In general, the question of water has exercised the imagination of traditional societies, but very especially so in India. Because from the earliest historical times, getting enough water for a life which allowed comfortable existence was always the question. And India has a rainy season in the monsoons, but there are dry parts of the year where water has to be thought about. And this has been a major thing in the making of cities all across India. So a large number of innovative solutions were evolved all over India. Wells, step wells, lakes, systems of interconnected irrigation, and so on, but all responding to a variety of topographies and geologies and rainfall patterns and usage patterns. You have to bear in mind that in order to do that, people have to closely observe what is the lie of the land, what is the geology of the soil below. Will the water go down or will it remain? Can it be collected? How does it happen? For that, you need to know geologies. You need to observe and predict the rainfall patterns, and you have to know the usage patterns. So there are specialists for each of these areas which traditional societies developed. So there were specific expertise: water prospecting, well digging, step well construction, lake systems, large-scale water management administration, governance of water infrastructure. All of these interlocked to create a societal knowledge system, not just a sort of professional knowledge system, but the whole of society came to be part of the administration of water. And thus, water was integral to the cultural heritage of every landscape of India. And it gave rise to a resilience which allowed those communities to persist and survive and sustain themselves over a great period of time. With the coming of new technologies, much of that was forgotten. And now we are discovering back again what was the intricacy of knowledge which we had and which would still, even today, be of value. So both tangible as well as intangible heritages in India are inextricably connected to water systems. And this is especially seen in a place like Bidar. Next slide. So we can look at any part of India The extreme left photograph shows a small village in Bengal. And you can see how the collection of water and the design of the settlement are completely locked into each other. In the middle photograph, you can see a place on the Kaveri belt in Tamil Nadu, where you can see there are 3 water bodies which ensure, and there is a canal system, and therefore both agriculture and human life and the support of all kinds of biodiversity is possible because of the careful management of water. And Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winning economist, has written about the South Indian governance systems for water. And it shows that the cooperation between various villages, etc., was vital. And I think even today one realizes that water is not something which can be done, which can be taken care of without paying close attention to the local systems at work. The extreme right was the Ahmedabad, and can we go back to that slide, please? Yes. Ahmedabad was a system of lakes. This is a very dry part of the country, and the lakes were places where there were villages, and the villages formed a network which connected to Ahmedabad. And this was a kind of distributed urban system, which was possible with the kind of careful storage, collection of water, the recharge of the aquifer, and the provision of rainwater for drinking. So all of these factors come into this. In Ahmedabad, for example, next slide, you see that the step wells were a wonderful architectural characteristic as well. And there are similar things which we are beginning to find in Bidar, that the whole manner of dealing with water is not only a question of functional value, but it is also a question of cultural pride. And I think this is where we have, in this heritage of water, we have the connection between the city and water as something which is at the root of the human condition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very rich presentation, Professor Chaya. It was very, very important to the way you pointed out the intricate connection between water and historic cities, that water was an integral part of the way the historic cities were designed and developed. We want to pick this point up a little bit in a few minutes when we have question and answer and some more discussion. But for now, I want to thank you and just move to a video presentation on Timbuktu. It's a short video on the city of Timbuktu.
Le réchauffement climatique.
Global warming has transformed our climate, meaning there's an overall increase in average temperatures because of human activity, and which has a lasting effect on weather and ecosystems. This is something that affects everything, even our valuable heritage. With global warming, there are a number of things going on. In particular, ponds get dried out. And the drying up of the Niger River has meant that land is impoverished, and we don't have many of the plant species we had before. Wood, for example, used for houses, in particular roofs, has disappeared. Across Mali, we see this happening, and people have to find substitutes for eucalyptus for wood, or rather, and eucalyptus is used, but it's not such good quality. Scientists claim that climate change is due to emissions driven by human activity, and mainly this is power production, power generation, heating, and fuel for transport, in addition to which there is land use, deforestation, agriculture, and cattle farming. If you look at the older part of Timbuktu, it's changed. It's no longer what it was. It's not like it was when it was listed. And without major efforts, we wouldn't be able to inscribe it on the list today. As I say, ponds and rivers are drying up, and this is having a deleterious effect on everything. And this means that people have to use tap water for things like washing, and they wash in the streets, and the runoff in these very narrow streets causes damage. It leads to general pollution. So the mysterious city today is subject to a wide range of attacks that are affecting everywhere. What we need to do first is raise public awareness of the consequences of global warming. We need to counter that. That's one thing, and the other is to do something about the sand and areas being covered with sand. The sand often leads to erosion. In a number of areas, we've suggested that trees be planted to consolidate the soil and combat the effect of sand. The WHO has said that climate change is responsible for 150 million deaths a year, and that could double if we are not fully aware of how serious this is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So now we have a little time for question and answers. I'm afraid that we have not been able to resolve the technical difficulties in connecting with Mr. Mohamed Ali Muwenje, the site manager of the city of Lamu in Kenya. So unfortunately, we will not be able to have him join us for his presentation, but we will. He has already prepared his presentation, so we will be including it in the final videos of the conference. So his lecture will be included there. But for the moment, we don't have his presentation, unfortunately. So we will. The floor is now open for your questions. Please don't hesitate to post your questions in the question and answer box or the chat box. I think that we have had some very provocative, thought-provoking presentations, so it would be very important to hear your thoughts. Okay, while we wait for your questions, I want to ask now a question to Mr. Costa. I'm just sorry, just trying to because there was, what you showed was extremely interesting about Parachi with the local economy and the biodiversity. But I'm wondering how. First of all, what impacts are you seeing of climate change, if you're already seeing any impacts? And today, the city itself and a lot of the region, I guess, is basing its economy on tourism. And how is that impacting these sort of natural systems that you're talking about?
Hi, Bob. First of all, the climate change is affecting us about when we start to think about the sea levels that is going high. And the central part of Paraty suffers a lot because of that we are right on the sea level. And then that's infect us. And we have many communities, Caiçaras communities living on the coast, and that's affects a lot. And as the water comes warmer, it's affect, unfortunately, the fishing activities in the city, which is our second activity, economic activity in the city, in Paraty. On the other hand, the tourism makes a huge impact on the way to preserve our culture, because a lot of people come in, living, and going out, and then this exchange is good, of course, but in certain way, we start to miss and lose, feel part of our culture. And so the local government has to work to preserve this in a good way, and affects potentially in a bad way the traditional communities such as Caiçaras. Quilombolas, indigenous, not that much, but mainly the Caiçaras, which has a small village with there's no electricity, and start to a lot of people coming to visit, and that's kind of interactive, bringing more violence and a lot of things as well. Because tourism is good, but once that you started, you have to protect and prepare a way to defend this, and then it's quite a good challenge. And we look forward to prepare some laws and programs to protect it, and it needs a lot of effort to make that happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see that there is a question from Monsieur Zekag. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Go ahead and ask your question, sir. It's actually not a question. It's more something that came to mind looking at what Mr. Sharia from India showed us about the carriers system going through the old city, and recalls what we have in Algeria, which is in the south of the country, out in the desert. It's called the Fungara. You know, in UNESCO, we have water calibration as a system. That's to say, something that measures and calibrates the system, and depending on the area to be irrigated, you have to have pipes of a certain diameter. And it's a system called Fogara, which runs through the city, the old part of the city, and every 50 meters you've got wells. They're working wells, because using them you can get into the pipe, which was man-made in the 7th, 8th, 9th century. And so they exist because you had to get water out into the desert. With water in the desert, you've got life. And so you go and look for water a long way from the village, and it would be brought into the village using this system of gutters or trenches that were man-made, dug by people. And every 50 meters, you would have these wells that provided ventilation. They were used as ventilation shafts, but at the same time you could collect water where it was needed. And at the end of the day, this water would go directly to the palm groves for irrigation. So the Fogara system still exists. It's operational. I'm not sure it's been as well maintained as you described in Bidar, but it will be interesting, I think, to run a comparison between the two systems, which to me seem very similar. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Chaya, would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, actually, this is a wonderful opportunity for us in Algeria and in Karnataka, in India, to exchange knowledge, because it seems that we also have the wells at every 50 meters. You can take the water out. The usage pattern seems to be also similar. And this seems to be something which is prevalent across from North Africa up to parts of India. I know, for example, that in Western India, there are towns where there are also these kanats where they used to draw the water. Unfortunately, most of them have been neglected, and it is now beginning to be understood that if we took care of them, then we will have a source of water which is not as destructive. Because if you get it out of a pipe and open a tap and get water, as the man from Timbuktu said, it creates problems after the water has been used. But also, you tend to use much more water. And if you have to use the water carefully, then a well is a better system, I think, in some ways. You might want to take water out a little more carefully if you have to make sure that you have some form of pumping, something that happens. So I think that, but certainly I will get in touch with you after this, and we will share knowledge across these continents. As we used to do even before. And I think it's the other kind of historic reconnection that we have to start. We used to, and now we stopped connecting. Now we should connect again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question again for you, Professor Chaya, where a question that is asking about how these wells are integrated into any local master plan. How are they protected? And who is responsible for the water management of the wells now? And what are the rights? Who can use this water now?
Yes. Now, these are questions on which work is being done now, because the contemporary planning systems often do not take into account the natural terrain. They do not take into account the geological factors. They do not take into account the careful provision of water, for example. They look at land use, they look at the geometry of subdivision of land, and they zone the city, but they do not really have provisions for doing this kind of work. And it is because of that Yuva and Shrishti are working together to convince the local authorities as well to start taking an interest in this. It will take time before we can make it part of local governance patterns, but we will keep on working in creating public awareness, as a result of which automatically, we hope, some kind of change in the manner of governing this. Because right now it doesn't belong to anybody in a way, except it belongs to people who have they use the water, or because they want to, they have some religious value given to it. And other than that, there is nothing, there is no sanction upon the misuse of it, and no sanction upon spoiling the water by throwing waste. And all these things are being worked on. It'll take time.
Thank you very much. We have a question for Mr. Costa from Dani Sodialmo. Thank you for your nice presentation. What strategy do you use for Parachi for monitoring and control of the beauty and richness of biodiversity?
So basically, we have local agencies. Parachi is a national heritage already for the architecture. the colonial architecture that we have here. And then we have the federal agencies and the national parks in Paraty already. And we also have local environment protection areas. So we have a few agencies here, local, like watching this and then caring about those matters. And it's a job that demands work daily, and it's quite an effort, but we really look for that matter, and then we really care about it. So basically that we have like federal governments, but we also have local agencies here that helps to monitoring that and then finding ways to develop into but still maintain our culture and our biodiversity.
Thank you very much. I think we have one last question from Professor Shahid Wavda. I may have missed this point, but can Professor Chaya provide a little more information on the role of the Iranians in the construction of the irrigation system? Were they the engineers or architects? And what role did local technicians play in this construction?
Yes. There is a great deal of knowledge that the Iranian rulers brought into India when they constructed the madrasa at Bidar, for example, which is completely cooled by passive cooling systems, which are of Iranian origin. Similarly, the building of qanats, as far as I know, has been a speciality of the Iranian builders. And I'm sure that this came into the making of Bidar. There is a depth of knowledge about how to dig wells and how to recognize geological formations amongst the well-digging communities in India. And so the two came together along with an understanding of masonry construction, which was also available in India. And so there is a combination of both the Iranian and the Indian knowledge in all the structures at Bidar, including the water structures. But the Iranians would have made major contributions. And I think that is a form of knowledge that came to us, which previously we did not have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. There is one last comment, which is not really a question, but a comment from Mr. Medeni Tekla Mariam from Asmara in Eritrea, who says, thank you so much, Professor Chaya, for sharing rich experience on underground water structure management. Okay, so now we move to the next part of our agenda, which is a discussion. We want to have just a very brief discussion with the mirror board. So I'm going to request my colleagues to put up the mirror board, which basically extracts the points from the presentations and discussions from yesterday and today. Can we have the mirror? Okay, so we have the mirror board and we have some key points that are highlighted. And you see also who is commenting on what. We can't really read this, so you'll have to make it a bit bigger. Yes, thank you. So what, we're looking at questions, for example, if you say, how can historic cities help us with strategies for climate action and to increase resilience? Then, we see what participants are saying, what the case studies are saying, and what the experts are saying. So, for instance, the experts said that you stimulate looking at the ecosystem in its entirety. You provide ideas to develop smart city models. You use the traditional urban agricultural activities. You focus on the traditional water systems. You look at tangible and intangible together, and you derive from the embedded knowledge and lessons from previous climate crises, that it's not something new that's happening for the first time. There's a lot that was said on resource efficiency and natural materials, on integrating the social and the economic, and the adaptive reuse and regeneration of historic places. So the letters that are big are the ones where these ideas have been reiterated by more than one expert, so that we know that this is a common theme. We also did the poll on what climate and water-related issues are doing to affect our cities, our historic cities. And of course, flooding, drought, wildfires, heat waves, and drinking water shortages came out most strongly. And looking at, climate change related issues and its impacts on water, the idea of infrastructure and drainage were the most dominant, along with water shortages. We also see that when we had participants talking, their concerns had to do with the future for seafront touristic cities. The separation of nature culture is something that experts talked about in this context, and the need to integrate nature and culture. The threat to underwater cultural heritage was also mentioned. Coastal erosion and flooding, as you can see, are big points. Looking at sand in the case studies, silting, drying out of trees, drying out of rivers. This came up repeatedly, and the rise of water levels. Again, the issue of sand, as you can see, comes up again and again. Next, can we move over to this, the last set, which is looking at creative global strategies. How can the HUL approach help us to do things differently, the historic urban landscape recommendation approach, so that traditional practices of green infrastructure could be integrated. But essentially what the participants said through the poll was to focus on landscape approach, on knowledge, on local knowledge, and a holistic approach to placemaking. And we see this also echoed in the idea of experts who said that introducing a landscape approach in city planning was important, and integrating traditional practices, taking a system approach, and also looking at raising awareness, addressing local livelihoods, defining current and future needs, and considering the culture-nature linkages. I'm just giving you an overview, but I think there is, perhaps Alba can explain a way for you to link to this and give you 5 minutes to see if you want to add some points. And then we can, or to speak some points in relation to this mirror board. Alba? Alba, could you explain?
Hello. Hi, Jyoti.
Yes, Carlotta. Please go ahead.
So we just shared in the chat a link to join the Miro board. So as you can see, there is a space for participants to put their own points of view on also what were their takeaways from the presentations from the experts yesterday, the case studies today. So you can just pop into the Miro board. You might have to create an account if you've never used it before, but it's free and it's quite easy. And anyway, if you don't manage to do it now, we'll just leave it open. So over the next few weeks, you can reflect on what you learned today and bring also your own ideas forward, so that we can reflect all of your points of view in this board. And we also made a list of resources where you can share your projects, your links to particular case studies, things that are interesting. We started including some of the ones that have been presented today, but please feel free to share your opinions and your resources with the rest of the group.
Thank you, Carlota. So would anybody like to, you can either do this on your own by following the link, or you could also use this as a moment to raise questions or propose comments. I see that there is, yes, Shreya Srivastava was asking that the Miro board was only a view only, and could we share a link for the editing access? So have we shared the editing access, Carlota, Alba? My colleagues, I'm checking with them if we have shared the editing access. Okay, while they enable the editing, anybody who would like to perhaps suggest some points? It could be also the participants, the speakers who are with us. Any thoughts, any ideas? We're going to leave the Miro board open for 1 month so that you can make your account and go back in and put in some points. We will also be sending you the link for the recording of this session, so you could also review the recording of the session if you wanted to and put in your points. But it would be very helpful to have that, because that would help us to make the conclusion of the meeting in a more concrete way. We're looking at the way forward and thinking, how can we, now that we have recognized the importance, we've talked about the relationship of water, especially, and historic cities. Today, we talked a lot about the relationship of biodiversity and traditional water systems with the historic cities. But to translate this in terms of climate action, and to translate it in terms of planning processes, how can we take these steps to policy and action? Any thoughts from any of the speakers, or any other questions or comments are most welcome at this time. Yes, please, Carola.
First, thanks a lot for excellent presentations, really fascinating, I have to say. What intrigues me, what I would like to hear everybody talk of, also looking at the Miro board, how can we bring the networked nature of water into a planning and historic urban landscape approach? So is there a way to bring this together so that we can show from the Indian case, which was beautifully presented, to the cases from yesterday, that we have something both to educate or work with professionals, crossing borders of municipalities, engaging different audiences?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody would like to respond to this? I saw that Professor Chaya had his hand up a few minutes ago.
Yes, actually, I think what we found extremely important is the involvement of a great variety of local people. And the planning guidelines or the planning systems would change only if there is a public opinion of a certain kind. And I think on the one side, we have to create awareness, but on the other side, in education, we need to talk about planning in a way in which we start seeing it as a comprehensive process, not something that deals with problems which are isolated and identified separately. But we have to create an educational system, because the same people who we educate will become the planners, the governance people, all of that. And so my feeling is that a great deal of work is required in creating educational paradigms which allow us to think of all the interconnected values and not just of isolated problem-solving methods.
Thank you very much. I think you're absolutely right about the educational system, but also I think the institutional processes somehow need to be modified as well, so that we're not looking at cities in this kind of a very siloed manner, where we just look at infrastructure development along one line and don't look at these interconnections. I think we're almost at 4 o'clock, and we want to move to a short video, but we have a few more minutes because the conclusions are very important to us after all these reflections, because that's what can help us to move forward and develop some recommendations or some policy guidance. And so your thoughts on what would be a way forward is very, very key here. And especially I want you to reflect on the interconnection between climate change, water, and energy transition, because that's really what we're talking about in the context of historic cities. Any thoughts from anyone? Okay, I see that there are no more comments or questions, no other thoughts. Yes, there is a question from Shreya Srivastava. Local practices and everyday mundaneness is also scholarship that we have to recognize and learn from, than only the disciplinary scholarship. Okay, that's very important. Anybody like to comment on this? No?
There's a hands up by...
Yes, please. Monsieur Zekak, allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Donc, bon, j'ai bien...
Well, thank you. I've been following the discussion very closely, and it's most interesting. Let me just go back to what I said during my presentation earlier. I was talking about two things that are very important to bear in mind. First, the relationship between two different types of layers of conceptual layers for the heritage. First, you have to look at what has been done in the modern age, in the 19th and 20th centuries, all of these things that have disrupted the natural values of the site. So my big question has always been, what can we do about this? What can we do about these buildings that are now part of the World Heritage Site itself? But what can we do with them to try to restore, insofar as possible, nature and the role of nature? So what can we do when you've got a city with all of these different layers, all these different strata covering 1,500 years? And there's one element in all these different historical layers that actually seems to constitute an insult to nature. So what should you do? Now, I know that we're supposed to preserve everything within this urban landscape, but we would have to have almost a surgical approach in order to restore the continuity of the nature in the site. Now, it's very, very complex. And so you imagine this challenge in a city where people are already living, going underground and trying to restore things. The natural element is something that is crucial. It's almost like having cancer below the skin, and it has to be addressed. So I'm not sure in your overall table there, I'm not sure how we can try to reflect this type of issue that I'm referring to. Perhaps you can find a way of including it in the Miro table. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for that suggestion, and thank you for that statement.
Okay, I want to see if there are any other thoughts. Otherwise, there is a question I see again in the chat box from Anju Malla. The traditional water system of Kathmandu Valley, some of which are still working, wells, ponds, and stone water spouts, would be great to share in this global forum. Thank you. That's a great idea. That's wonderful to hear. I see also that Mr. Lassana Cissé has his hand up. Monsieur Cissé, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of those who've helped prepare the Miro table. There are 2 points, though, that I think that are very important when we talk about the urban landscape in the present and in the past. And this has to do with everything that is related to natural disasters. We've spoken a lot about flooding. We've talked about rising sea levels. We've talked about the effects of the pandemic, even. But there's another issue, which is the energy transition. That's something that we should focus on as well. And optimizing cities in terms of their energy consumption. Energy is essential, especially for those of us in African countries. Solar energy, for example. How can we make it possible for historic cities like Timbuktu in the middle of the desert or other places in southern Algeria? What can we do to make these cities fully autonomous when it comes to managing their own energy supply and consumption? And this is something that ties in with water, of course. And another point is the management of public areas, and seeing that against a backdrop of population growth. Population growth is a real challenge. We know that in some parts of African cities, the population has grown threefold in just the last 10 years. So what are we going to do about this? What can we do to manage these protected areas faced with this population pressure? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. I think Mr. Cissé has already talked about the points that I was going to raise. Just to wrap up, I would like to invite each of the experts who are with us to share 3 points that they would like to include in any of these mirror boards, or provide advice or recommendations on any 3 points. Let's begin with Carola.
Thanks a lot, Jyoti. I was still working actually on your question on how to tie water, climate change, and energy transition together. And in some ways, it seems to me that water is kind of the thermometer. It's the one where we're all in it together. We can no longer, the sea level rise is happening all around the world. It's touching all places together. And so while we need local practices and everything, also these local practices globally are interrelated. So in some ways, the sea level becomes the thermometer of how good or not we address climate change. And it becomes the thermometer of how much we always need to protect the heritage, but how difficult it will become to protect it. And so what we need, and I think this may be a comment also on the Miro board, to make this into a holistic approach that takes into account both the circular practices and the local citizens, what Professor Chaya was talking about, but also the interrelatedness between Africa, United States, Japan, you name it, and all the places on the world. So that's not the answer to your second question. That's maybe an attempt to answer your first question, and then to rely on the knowledge about this. Historically, we had this knowledge on interconnectedness. So bringing that back can hopefully help us address those contemporary challenges then.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Monsieur Zake, est-ce que vous voulez...
Mr. Zake, do you have any thoughts that you would like to share with us at this stage? Are there any thoughts that you would like to share with us, Mr. Zake?
Comme c'est un peu la première fois.
Well, this is the first time I've ever seen this type of table, in fact. And we're grateful that you're going to leave it open for about a month. That'll give us the time to look through each one of these little boxes. We're not sure if we really understand it yet, but we can look at all of that, look at all of the input from the experts, depending on which case study we're talking about. And then afterwards, we will make our contributions on the basis of our experience managing the area in Algeria. Let's not forget the fact that I was the director of the National Office of Cultural Property in Algeria up until 2 years ago. So there are more than 38 historic cities in Algeria that I'm familiar with. And I am familiar with a lot of the problems and issues that they have to contend with in the field of preserving the heritage. Now, I haven't really spent much time thinking about nature or the natural values, and in particular, natural disasters. That's something I haven't given much thought to, but we will start doing that, and we will take on board many of the comments that we've heard from the other panelists today. We'll also draw on the experience from other countries in the continent, and I'm sure that we'll find some useful things to add to the table. But for the time being, we don't have any clear input to suggest yet. But I would be very pleased to be able to make contributions to the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You don't have to contribute only directly to the table. You could also just reflect on the table and send us your contributions in an email, and we will put it onto the Miro board, because the Miro board is really a way to distill from each presentation and each participant's interventions some key points that we see repeated in order to be able to come to some more abstracted conclusions, because otherwise, and to find a way forward. What are the key issues? What are the key strategies? What do you see as the key needs? How can we achieve what we are looking to do, which is to connect nature, climate change, water, energy transition? You said 38 cities in Algeria, which is amazing, 38 historic cities. How can any of these cities, what's the way forward for them? I think if you just sent us a couple of bullet points that we could include, we will put it into the Miro board. We don't want to burden you with additional work to learn a new app, but it's just another way to be able to distill this point. Professor Chaya, would you, thank you again, Monsieur Zakeg. Professor Chaya.
Peut-être rajouter un petit aspect.
I would just like to add one more thing. You know that managing the natural resources and areas in our country is something that depends on which part of the country you're talking about. It's a huge country. We have different climates, the southern part of the country that you're familiar with. Then we have the central part of the country where we have oases and cities around the oases, and they have their own sets of issues. Then we have cities that are up in the mountains. They have their own specificities. And then we have all of the coastal cities that were occupied by many other civilizations over the course of history because they're right on the shoreline. And they have their own specificities. Now, one of the things that we find in the south, not the extreme south, but in the south of the country, Waldau, for example, or Terit, cities like that, they have problems with the water table rising. And as you know that in certain parts of the southern part of our country, there are salt lakes. And so you get infiltration of salt in the drinking water. And this completely disrupts everything, and not just the drinking water supply, but masonry work, everything that has to do with building materials. So again, another set of issues, completely different. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Chaya, your thoughts?
Yes.
Your final 3 points.
Well, maybe not three, but perhaps two.
Okay.
So one, I think it cannot be reiterated more and more. We need to understand that as researchers or as people who are at the forefront of thinking about things often, our language tends to become very arcane. And the everydayness and what Shreyas mentioned about the mundane language. I think this, so in this final set of recommendations, we must have something which is directly affecting people. And I think there, the water is a wonderful gateway. I'm very glad that the title of this was Cities, Climate Change, Water and Energy, because water is something that affects us straight away directly. And I think through that, we could bring about understanding about the very large dangers and the fact that cities need to take these into account. So one is everyday mundane language is my one point. The second point is that the value of this is how we find that knowledge is interconnected. That we saw even in this brief, this session only, we saw that across the world, there were things which were shared, whether we were talking about Vietnam, or whether we were talking about Algeria, or whether we were talking about India, the categories of knowledge were the same. So that interconnectedness, which I think Carola was talking about, is also a knowledge interconnectedness. And we should say that the knowledge interconnectedness should be used to create more action.
Thank you very much. I think that this point about knowledge interconnectedness is also echoed by several of the other participants. Monsieur Cissé, vous êtes là?
Mr. Cissé, are you still with us? Mr. Cissé, are you still with us?
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me? Mr. Cissé, are you still on the line?
Mr. Cissé. Okay, so let's then, okay, Carola, please, your hand is up.
I did not hear the question, says Mr. Cissé. I did not hear the question.
Monsieur
Mr. Cissé.
For 3 points that you might like to contribute to the final conclusions, recommendations as advice that we can take away from this session that can be applied for historic cities in managing, in strategies for climate change, managing water and energy transition. What would be your 3 top bits of advice?
Well, thank you. I think that this is something that I already touched upon in my last statement. The 3 key points are, first of all, the management of water resources, be it rainwater or seawater. Water is fundamental for any city. Now, there are many case studies that have given us many ideas about how we can manage droughts and sea level rising, and how all of these things can be taken into consideration in managing the historic urban landscape. The second point is energy. We've already discussed this. We were just talking about it. Energy is essential, and energy is linked to climate change too. In fact, yesterday I spoke a lot about this, the consumption of firewood, which is what most people use. Now, in Algeria, they have a lot of natural gas, but in the Sahel countries, most people, the only source of fuel they have is firewood. or charcoal. And this is a critical point because it leads to deforestation, and it also increases urban pressure because a lot of people sell firewood and charcoal in cities. But then we also have electricity coming from dams. Yesterday I criticized dams, but there are alternatives. For example, solar energy. Again, how can we electrify cities using solar energy? And somebody spoke about this morning as well, I think. There are some individual initiatives, but I think that we could put this into part of an overall master plan for managing the historic urban landscape. And the third point would be the management of public areas. Again, seen against the backdrop of population growth. There is a huge amount of pressure on public spaces, parks, etc. And this is something that we see in many cities across the Sahel. There's erosion from sudden flash floods, from wind, etc. So these are the three things that I think we really have to come up with concrete recommendations on this. But I could also put this in writing and send it to you later on. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much for that. This is a very interesting statement. And we certainly note those recommendations. Thank you. Mr. Shah has gone.
Mr. Costa, who in case he's still online. Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa? Perhaps he has left. Okay, well, we now have a video that we would like to share with you. It's one that has been prepared in collaboration with the UNESCO Chair for Water, Historic Cities, Water and Port Cities that Carola holds, the UNESCO Chair Professor at the Technical University of Delft. Carola, if you want to introduce the video in just 2 minutes, and then we'll turn it on.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. So the main goal of this video, but also of an educational program, I just put it in the chat, is about connecting the fields of water and heritage, which are often seen as very different fields, which move at different speeds, which have professionals and that don't necessarily talk to each other, and which require a new engagement. And so what I was saying before, how can we both refine, rethink the water sector to make it aware of long-standing knowledge about the needs of heritage, and on the other hand, to make the heritage sector aware of the larger system of water. So those are basically, this is the goal of the film and also the educational program, to generate this conversation. It's really a Kickstarter for a longer intervention. So I really hope that you will enjoy it. I might just put one point of caution here. It starts with, we should have more cities. And the goal is also to expand this documentary. But in order to keep it to the 10, 12 minutes that we have here, we had to extract several. And I've already been thinking during our conversation today, there are plenty of you whom I would love to get in touch with and continue this interview series, some of which are in the online courses of Waterworks. Some have made it into the documentary. So this is only the beginning. And if you like, I would be delighted to get in touch with everyone on the screen, with many of you if you're available. Thank you, Jyoti.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we can launch the video.
It's an honor for me to address you on everything water in the context of cultural heritage, climate, sustainable development, and a better future. The past is not a recipe for the future. 99% of all our investments are increasing climate change and are increasing our vulnerability. Only in 1% can we find salvation or inspiration for better future solutions. Learning from the past takes a different aspect than only looking back. It really means positioning the past in the current and future challenges. And replicating the past will not bring a better future. We have to move away, shy away from non-responsive, even reactive approaches where we're in the midst of. Vested interests, a replication of mistakes that drives every step. No, we have to become radically proactive and inclusive, comprehensive and sustainably, and really look at the future. But the future, the scenarios, the uncertainties, and how that works should inform our decision making too. So it's this tension between past and future that gives us a clear pathway where we have to go.
The recommendation on the historic urban landscape is first and foremost a way of understanding built heritage as a landscape. It's a landscape approach to identifying, conserving, and managing heritage. It looks at heritage as the outcome or the result of the interactions between the built, the natural, and the local community. So these three elements become very key. The protection of heritage in this sense has to be done at many different levels, from planning to the management of people and practices to enable them to continue to make the place meaningful.
Protection of historic cities, in general, the protection of man-made environments where you have this very fragile type of equilibrium is a very difficult question. It's a question that we can, I think, only look through via a more general perspective.
Where it comes to the whole approach, it's very much about how can you combine things and how can you look holistic to these issues. How can you position heritage into other currents and urgent needs and challenges?
We can learn from historic places and communities to rethink how we live with water today. We need to protect and, where necessary, adapt our heritage sites so that they can inspire future generations. Our lost water systems, tangible and intangible, can inspire new, sustainable practices. Therefore, let's take a closer look at the current challenges of water in historic port cities. The spatial form of these cities is often closely connected to water challenges. Their socio-economic structures derive from global trade and development, as did their policies, cultures, narratives, laws, and ways of doing things. To live more sustainably, we should rethink how to value water and heritage. Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Venice in Italy. And St. Louis in Senegal are UNESCO World Heritage Cities. Conversations with professionals from the cities reveal challenges and opportunities for connecting water and heritage in ways that aid sustainable development. Amsterdam is a key example of a water-related heritage site and an active port city. The city's water-derived attractiveness also comes with challenges. The subsoil is unstable, leading to the collapse of several of the historic quay walls. Amsterdam is located 2 meters below sea level. To preserve the historic site, it requires new approaches.
The Amsterdam grachten system is a nice example of a very historic system which still is part of the current water management system of the whole region around Amsterdam. And there are structures in it which were constructed in the 15th century and which are still an essential part of the water management system. All these different elements, the 20th century elements, the 19th century elements, and the elements of the 15th, 16th, 17th century, they still are working together. And that we build upon our own history, that is, I think, very important to be aware of and to show.
Venice in Italy is a world-famous port city and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. For centuries, the Venetians had to deal with the tides of the Adriatic Sea. Floods always threatened the slowly sinking historic city.
If we want to save Venice, and I think we should save Venice, we need to save the planet. We need to save the planet because we need, first of all, that climate change should not go beyond a certain consequences. So we need to do what is possible to mitigate climate change. And if we take the history of Venice, you can understand that the approach, the attitude of the Venice Republic was very clear, and it was not working against the lagoon, but it was working with the lagoon. And getting the lagoon to a kind of stable condition, which nevertheless extremely dynamic. So this dynamic balance is a little bit probably what we have lost. We have lost because we want to stabilize in a more rigid way things in order to be sure that the protection, for example, can be always there and possible. So I think what we should recover is not a specific maybe type of infrastructure, but more this attitude that is not looking for the final solution, but is only looking for provisional, experimental conditions where you can test this dynamic type of equilibrium.
The island of St. Louis in Senegal is uniquely challenged by water issues. Located on an island at the mouth of the Senegal River, it faces the Atlantic Ocean and has been a hub of shipping for some 300 years. The challenge of a rising sea level is particularly urgent in St. Louis.
Aucun projet ne devrait se faire aujourd'hui à Saint-Louis sans tenir compte de ce phénomène de l'eau. Aussi bien pour le fleuve, les deux bras de fleuve, la moussure, que l'océan Atlantique. À mon avis, c'est une question importante pour que Saint-Louis soit préservé, patrimoine mondial, mais que Saint-Louis soit préservé pour les communautés, parce que même si Saint-Louis est site du patrimoine mondial, Saint-Louis n'est pas une île déserte. C'est une île habitée. C'est des communautés qui sont là, c'est une île vivante. On ne le fait pas pour l'UNESCO, on le fait pour nous-mêmes, on le fait pour les communautés qui sont là.
On a mis beaucoup d'argent sur le site, mais sans avoir les résultats escomptés. Et aujourd'hui, ce qu'on constate, c'est qu'il y a vraiment un hiatus entre l'importance des fonds dégagés, investis, et la faiblesse des résultats. Comme on dit, on n'arrête pas la mer avec ses bras.
Mais c'est une question qu'il faut voir globalement et trouver des solutions, si vous voulez, applicables à l'échelle internationale, avec une coopération internationale importante, avec un changement, si vous voulez, de bonnes pratiques, que les experts, si vous voulez, des pays comme des pays qui vivent avec l'eau, des pays insulaires comme le Japon, comme les autres pays insulaires qui ont une technologie avancée, puissent quand même travailler avec des pays comme les pays en développement, comme en Afrique, en Amérique latine, etc., pour aider un peu avec une coopération internationale à trouver des solutions communes pour lutter contre les changements climatiques et sauvegarder ces villes d'eau, ces villes du patrimoine mondial qui sont liées à l'eau, qui sont des villes côtières, bien des villes insulaires. Et pour moi, donc, le futur, c'est un peu dans cette vision inclusive, globale, dans cette vision vraiment holistique du développement qu'il faut voir la survie de ces villes comme Saint-Louis.
There is more and more understanding that economic values cannot save us. No? So I think if we start from this perspective, there is only one way to get out of this situation, that is to open to other values. So from this perspective, to give value to the water, to give value to water cities, to water cultures, will be a way also to save the planet.
If we want to look ahead, it better be comprehensive, long-term. Matching long-term comprehensive planning with short-term innovative approaches. In this mix between long-term and short-term, it is about partnerships, collaborations and coalition, inclusion of all, and at the same time in a very transparent and accountable way. That is how you build capacity. Capacity that is institutional, that is individual, that even is informed. I set up a program in Asia called Water as Leverage, a program that really uses the multitude of water's capacity across the SDGs in a process that is innovative, that is creating space, time and room, safe space or soft space, to ensure that there is the capacity to innovate, to invest in each other and build coalition. I can conclude in our cities and by looking and learning from the past for a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that video and the examples that you covered so well. So with that, we come to the end of this conference on historic cities, climate change, water and energy transition. I want to thank very warmly of course, the Ministry for Culture, Science, Environment of the Netherlands, but also our team here, who have the different teams who have been working very hard for this conference. Our technical team with as well as our interpreters, many thanks to them, and the team of the World Heritage Cities Program, Alba Zamarbid, Carlota Marijuan Rodriguez, Camila Vigneshwaranathan, and Giacomo Martinez. Many thanks to all of them. But most of all, the thanks go to all of you for all your contributions, for all that you have shared with us of your experiences, your knowledge, and your thoughts, which is really critical. So thank you to all the panelists, all the participants, all the experts who have shared so generously to this. We are compiling all of these, and we will be putting together a report on all of the material from this conference. We will also be putting up the videos and you will find them on YouTube, and we will share, of course, and I hope you're all receiving Urban Notebooks. We will share with you on Urban Notebooks the links for the videos and so on. We're also looking to develop some other activities related to these topics on climate change and water and energy transition that we will keep you informed of, and a publication that goes more in depth into each of these issues, and that also captures the 10th anniversary of the Historic Urban Landscape recommendation. So last but not the least, I want to invite you to sign up for the HUL call for action if you haven't already done so. My colleagues put it up in the chat. Please sign up for the HUL call for action, and maybe climate change action is what you would like to focus on for this. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Au revoir et merci. Merci beaucoup pour tout.